Professor Reed, thanks for being with us. And today I'm anxious to hear your thoughts about the fall of the Roman Empire and what seems to me increasing, striking, and alarming parallels with what's going on in the United States today. Am I an alarmist? Am I overly imaginative, or do you see it that way too?
Well, thank you for having me, Larry. And yes, I think there are alarming parallels, so I don't think you're overstating it at all. Of course, there are many differences, but when you look at the broad trends of the fiscal situation in ancient Rome in the latter days of the Roman Republic and the fiscal situation here in this country, you see a lot of the same things. You see deficits, you see out of control spending and debt, and promises that the politicians are making that are buying votes, but are putting the country on the long-term track to fiscal insolvency.
Modern equivalent of bread and circuses?
Yeah, exactly. That's what it was called back in the ancient Roman days. But we have the same thing, all sorts of free stuff being offered. And even though we have $1 trillion deficit in just this year's budget alone, or close to it, uh, most of the candidates running for president today have a laundry list of trillions more that they want to spend.
Professor, something I don't understand. I could see pandering to the masses today because we have, in name at least, a democracy where people can actually vote.
Yeah.
So politicians would have to curry favor, have to pander to increasingly great extent these days. But in the days of the Roman Empire, they ruled with an iron hand. I mean, couldn't they control rioting and mobs and all that? Why did they have to cater to the mobs when they had total control over the masses? I don't understand that.
Well, keep in mind, Roman history is really about 1,000 years in duration,
Hmm.
and about half of that was as a republic, and the
Right,
second half is as an imperial autocracy or empire.
right.
So, certainly by the days of the empire, the emperors did have the kind of power you're talking about. Although many of them were not very safe at all themselves in their own position, they were assassinated, many of them. But the parallels between the United States today and ancient Rome really come primarily from that first 500 years of Roman history when it was a republic, when
Right.
there were institutions of representative government, rule of law, independent judiciary. That look a lot more like what America has developed over the last 200 plus years.
But I thought the pandering, the catering to the masses really took hold strongly during the rise of the empire. The empires were staging bread and circuses, elaborate games in the Colosseum. Didn't all that come in the empire phase?
Oh, they continued it. The emperors continued it for sure, and in some ways even expanded it. But the rise of the Roman welfare state actually began around the middle part of the second century BC.
That
Uh,
soon.
oh yeah, 150 years before the empire, and it's what brought down more than anything else. It's what brought down the republic and paved the way for the empire.
When you talk that way, when anyone talks that way, you could easily be accused of being a right-wing guy who, is down on welfare and down on the poor masses and all that. Now, that's an easy characterization.
Yeah.
How would you straighten out a person who's characterizing your thoughts that way about the welfare state?
Well, I would say look at history and also remember that by welfare state, I mean something more broadly than most people think of it. But when you think of welfare state, so often you think of poor people getting something from the government, but I mean it much more broadly. I mean a situation in which the political process is used by people of all incomes to get special favors, to get subsidies, to get handouts, to redistribute the wealth, and so forth. In ancient Rome, in the last century and a half of the Roman Republic, it wasn't just the poor that were getting something from the central government, it was all walks of society. It started with veterans, then it went to the military more broadly, and ultimately, even rich people were using the government for special favors.
And you're saying when it first began with the rise of Rome, the Republic, everybody was hardworking, everybody was imbued with character, and that's what made it successful and eventually created the fatness that created its demise. But you're saying in the beginning, everybody was stalwart and upright and moral and hardworking, and everybody pulled their load. Was it really that idealistic?
Well, I think it would be an oversimplification to say that everybody was of that way, but it is accurate, I think, to say for the first few hundred years of the ancient Roman Republic, the things you described were generally the way of life. There were plenty of exceptions, I'm sure. There always are. Even in the best of societies, you got a few slackers or dishonest people or people who use the government in ways they shouldn't. But for the most part, the first few hundred years of after they threw off the tyranny of the kings, beginning around 509 BC, the Roman people were generally hardworking. They were this is the time when words that we use today have their origin, like gr- um, gravitas and incontinentia, meaning discipline, self-discipline, things like that. I may have the word precisely slightly incorrect there, but those virtues dominated Rome for the first several hundred years.
Now, could you be more specific about the incursion of the intrusion of the welfare state in the broad sense as you were describing? I mean, specifically, what were they doing that eventually created the demise?
One of our best historians today is a man named Mike Duncan, who wrote a fantastic book called The Storm Before the Storm. And he accounts or recounts the last couple centuries of the Roman Republic. And he says that if there's one year, and I tend to agree with him, that you could point to as pivotal in all this, it would be 146 BC. And that is because it was in that year that the Romans crushed Carthage in North Africa
Hmm.
and also crushed a rebellion in Corinth in present day Greece. And that set them on the course of empire and also caused a class of military people to come back to Rome, be celebrated as great heroes, and be eligible then for all sorts of benefits. Uh, the Roman Republic in those early years began granting those benefits, but the problem always is with every welfare state that if you start with a few, everybody else sooner or later is going to say, well, why not me? I'm special too. Why can't I get on the gravy train? Why should I just pay for it and all of it goes to somebody else? So then they started a grain dole whereby Rome passed out enormous amounts of subsidized grain, sometimes free grain, to increasing numbers of people. So that by the time of Julius Caesar, in around 40 or 45 BC, about a third of the people of Rome itself were on the public grain dole.
Really?
Yeah.
And weren't they also migrating into Rome itself and leaving the farmed fields? Wasn't that
Yeah.
going on as well?
Yes, they were. One of the negative implications of these foreign conquests increasingly was that the Roman military would bring slaves back, and Roman military people were often given substantial tracts of land. And then they used slave labor to compete with private farmers, driving them out of business. And increasingly, those private farmers, bankrupt, went into the cities.
When they got to Rome, though, there was no work for them there either, was there?
Well, increasingly there wasn't. The first century BC was a time of increasing economic chaos, recession, military strife, civil strife, and that meant an atmosphere in which people who could have made investments and built enterprises and provided employment were not doing so. And so, yes, it was a time of unemployment and of a great deal of problems stemming directly from the previous government interventions, its spending, its warfare, and its previous generous subsidies.
Now, also a swollen military, overextended abroad,
Yeah.
couldn't control the borders. The so-called barbarians would come in, actually be used as part of the Roman army as mercenaries, settled on the borders. The Romans gradually gave them their technology and their tactics in fighting, and the barbarians eventually turned that against Rome itself. correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. And on top of it, Larry, many of these barbarians were absorbed into the military, worked their way
Right,
up into important positions from inside. The barbarian assault on Rome, which came primarily from the north and the northeast, from the Vandals, the Visigoths, and the Goths, and so forth. That's what ultimately causes the extinction of the Western Roman Empire itself. But it
right.
really started hundreds of years before. The Romans were able to repel those for a long time when Rome was strong, but increasingly they were sapping themselves of the strength and the finances that they needed to go up against the barbarians.
And taxation rose as the currency was debased.
That's correct. Both taxes rose and inflation rose. And of course, by inflation, it's important to define that term. A lot of people think inflation is rising prices, but I'm an economist who believes that that's a symptom of the inflation. The inflation itself is an increase in the quantity of money and credit. One of the effects of that is for prices to rise. And you see at the time of Emperor Nero in the middle part of the first century, still early in the empire phase of Roman history, the systematic debasement of the currency begins. Nero and subsequent emperors would call in the coins of the realm, melt them down, mix in cheaper junk metals, thereby reducing the quantity of precious metal content, and then it'd have a lot more molten metal to make a lot more coins. But to give you an example, at the time of Nero, the denarius, principal Roman coin, was about 96, 98% silver. But within 200 years, it was down to a fraction of 1% silver. The rest was all junk. And it produced what one historian, Max Shapiro, calls a cyclonic superinflation in the 4th century AD.
And speaking of Nero and other emperors that were clearly not up to the job, he supposedly fiddled as Rome burned, whether that's historically accurate or not. But I mean, it's accurate in terms of a lot of these emperors that were really so destructive, more and more so as the empire swelled and it became soaked in luxury goods, and it became an effete society similar people say to what's going on today. So, I mean, there was also that element that during the Republic, the leaders, and they had several leaders, that they had checks and balances. They didn't have just one guy controlling
Yeah,
everything. And you had people that seemed to know what they were doing. They were competent to
yeah.
run that society. But then the emperors become so out of touch and so involved in their own fantasies and whatever that that was also an element in the empire falling apart, was it not?
Oh, it sure was. And you're so right. In the days of the Republic, with limitations on government and with the general Roman character being much higher than it would be a few hundred years later, uh, people tended to support good people for high office. And if bad people got in there, well, they could be gotten rid of. The top position in the old Roman Republic was consul. There were always two of them. They were each could veto the decisions of the other, but they were limited to 1 year. So even if you had a bad one, he was gone in 1 year. But by the time of the emperors, of course, who think of themselves as holding the position for life, uh, and of course, without the checks and balances that the people and other institutions had to keep bad people from getting to the top, then you get these real nutcases who I like to say they one emperor after another didn't have his tray table and seat back, and they're locked in upright positions.
And who was a dramatist that said the world loses a great artist when he was being assassinated by
That
the
was Nero.
that was Nero, yeah.
That was Nero. Yeah, he thought the world was really going to miss him, but I don't think anybody did.
Well, you've often said that character determines destiny and determines the greatness of a society. And what you're saying is that the character of Rome changed from the Republic to the Empire. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, there was a time in the first few hundred years of Roman history, and the slide in the other direction happened gradually. It wasn't overnight. But there was a time when Romans held generally fast to virtues of hard work, respect for life and property, respect for contracts, enterprise, and that kind of thing. But I think maybe a good summation of the problem of their slide into a welfare state and dictatorship is what's known as Kirchner's first law. It was first written by Howard E. Kirchner, great economist and a personal friend of mine. He used to say that when a self-governing people uh, decide that they can use the political process to vote themselves benefits, the process will not stop until the last bone of the last taxpayer is picked bare. People just begin to realize, hey, instead of working for a living, let's vote for one. And down the drain go all the virtues of respect for others. Now it's a grab bag, try to get from government whatever you can at other people's expense.
Another parallel that some people might draw between the Roman Empire and what's going on in America today, mass migration, more so in Europe, but it's also coming here. How destructive was that to the Roman Empire in addition to all these elements that we're talking about? How much of a influence in the destruction of the empire was this mass migration of barbarians?
Well, I think you have to separate that barbarian migration from non-barbarian migration. I mean, there were a lot of people from around Europe who came to Rome, and with good intentions. They recognized that, wow, this place has got something to offer. It's got, for much of the Republic's history, it offered opportunities for growth, even citizenship, ultimately, and progress and entrepreneurship. But in time, that composition of migration changes away from people coming for enterprising reasons and wanting to assimilate and be a part of a vibrant society, to migrating so they could either to use the government to steal from others, get benefits at public expense, or in an even more nefarious way, just sort of worm their way into the system to bring down Rome and serve the cause of hostile barbarian forces.
Immigration without assimilation, that sounds pretty much like what's going on today.
Yeah, that's disastrous for any country. One of the greatest things for any country is to have a melting pot where people come because of all the right reasons. They want to be enterprising, they want to build businesses, and so forth. And then they want to be assimilated. They want to be part of the country they've come to instead of revert back to what they left behind. That's what forms a homogenous society, but still preserves the diversity of the different cultural backgrounds. But when you got people coming and building their own little enclaves, and with the mentality that I don't want to assimilate, I hate this place. I'm just here because I like the scenery or whatever, or I want to get what I can at other people's expense. Then you got a real problem.
Why do the Romans allow that, and why is the Western world today allowing that?
Well, I think in the late Republic, the Roman government allowed some of that because they were buying votes, is what it amounted to. They saw people coming and as an opportunity, if they could offer more than the next guy in the way of benefits, they saw an opportunity to cement their own political base and support. Um,
But
that's
they couldn't vote, could they? The plebeians or
Oh,
whatever
they could
it was?
become, oh yeah, they could become citizens even.
Yeah.
Remember, in Rome, you had the Senate for a long, long time, and there that was made up of those who could trace their family ancestry back to the founders of Rome, and they were sort of the noble families of Rome. But they also had popularly elected assemblies.
Mhm.
And over the course of Roman history, until the empire anyway, those assemblies assumed power and were almost co-equal to the Senate, maybe more so by the time of the crack up of the Republic.
Well, the Roman legions and the Praetorian Guard especially, they themselves became a control element, where the emperors were in fear of them, were they not?
Yeah, that's right. And that becomes ever more the case as the empire wears on. You have the emperors with all this power and so many people wanting to grab it from them or get them out of the way by assassinating them. So the Roman emperors would gather around them their own personal military, the Praetorian Guard. But there are many examples in the history of the empire where the Praetorian Guard could be bought off by a competing would-be emperor. By other powers, and actually assassinated one emperor after another when they thought they could get a better deal from somebody else.
Professor, it occurs to me that what happened to Rome is really an inevitable evolution where you start with a strong, unified society. It becomes successful because of those basic virtues. And then it becomes a victim of its own success. You know, people become spoiled, they become lazy, they start going off and just indulging themselves. Isn't that an inevitable evolutionary curve that would happen, that has happened over and over again? It's inevitable.
It has happened so many times. It's in history. It's almost monotonous. But I would stop short, Larry, of saying that it's inevitable because that suggests that there's no turning back. That even if people's ideas were to change, there's something in the stars that says that they can't change things for the better. If I thought that, then I'd quit what I'm doing and stop talking about freedom, because I would say it's all over.
Well,
I think
how far, go ahead, Professor.
I was going to say it's rare, but it is possible as long as we are creatures of our ideas and the way we think. It is possible for people who have gone far down this awful path to come to their senses, to realize how and why they've strayed, and to save themselves. It just doesn't happen, though, that often.
How far down that path is the U.S. at this point?
I think it's well down that path. If I had to say, if you had to pick a comparable time in ancient Roman history to say that's about where America is, I would say it's probably around 100 AD, which means less than a century to go before the end of the Old Republic. But timelines are so fluid and things happen faster today than ever before. We haven't yet, we don't see dictators on the horizon. We don't see military guys who are forming their own armies and marching on Washington, or anything like that. You saw that in the late Roman Republic. But we do have a welfare state that is so far along. There are many of us who shake our heads and say, how can this ever be paid for without a lot of inflation and burdening future generations unconscionably?
So how do you turn it around, realistically speaking?
I think the only way is through education. And I don't mean government education. I don't mean necessarily even traditional classroom education. I mean, all of us who understand the importance of ideas like freedom, free enterprise, private property, limited government, we've got to do a better job at passing those ideas on to our children, to our neighbors, to our friends. We've got to support those who are propagating those ideas, because ultimately what happens in the policy world is the result of the way people are thinking up here. That's how they vote, because that's the way they think.
Professor, you and I are both with a generation when the mission of colleges were to turn out people to teach them how to think, not what to think.
Yeah.
To teach them logic, to have an open mind, marketplace of ideas, and that way arrive at your own, hopefully objective conclusions. Political correctness has now gripped campuses, especially, and America in general. Now, isn't that really going to destroy what you're talking about, education as a hope for turning things around?
It could certainly do so if it isn't checked in some way and reversed. I think it's one of the most ominous trends in the country. But keep in mind that a lot of that kind of thing is what makes the headlines. What doesn't make the headlines are the many, many kids who are going to decent schools and where free speech is not shut down. That doesn't make a headline. But nonetheless, the trend is not good. And unless alumni and college administrations begin to crack down and turn this around, it does bode very poorly for the future.
Even administrators are folding under political correctness. As a matter of fact, you had an experience yourself recently, did you not, where you were talking about how the Romans were great road builders, and you were corrected by a student who said, no, what was it, the Mayans were better than the Romans? And
Exactly right.
of course,
That
that was
was a
because, the Romans were white Westerners and the Mayans were indigenous people, so they had to be better than the Romans, right?
You're right. I saw it firsthand. It was at the University of Colorado, Denver campus. Uh, I think a year ago, last April, or 2 years ago. I forget now. But anyway, I was only 5 minutes into my talk on Rome. I had not said anything that could even remotely be thought of as politically controversial. But I just simply said at one point that the magnitude of Roman road building was so massive that the world wouldn't see anything like it again until the U.S. in the 1950s and the interstate
Yeah.
road campaign. Well, then that's when one of the kids blurted out, "That's not true." And I said, "What are you talking about? Why do you say that?" And he said, "The Mayans, in Guatemala, uh, they were bigger road builders." And I said, "No, how could they be? In fact, you could take the entire the entire Aztec or Mayan Empire, I should say, Mayan Empire, and fit it all into half of the Roman province of Egypt."
I don't know,
And
Professor. I think you should be shipped off to a re-education camp.
yeah,
And
I'm sure he would have been happy to do that. But
that's
he
kind of,
said that simply because his professors told him that, because, again, as you hit the nail on the head, the idea was the Romans were white Europeans. They couldn't have done anything wrong. And the Mayans, in spite of decapitations and human sacrifice and a million other things, internecine warfare, they were still indigenous people and they can do no wrong.
and these are college students,
Yeah.
and the professors are instilling that in them. Now, what I think about is, I was of the '60s generation where it was getting a bit crazy back then, but now you have college professors that are two generations beyond that. So
Yeah.
all this has grown the
Yeah.
extremism, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, it leaves you scratching your head, and you have to ask, where does this come from? Why do these people often have tenure? Well, I think tenure is probably one of the reasons they're so nutty, because they're insulated and isolated from the real world around us. Don't have to worry, because the colleges today are so heavily subsidized by government. They don't even have to worry so much about pleasing real customers.
Of
Uh,
course, without tenure, I mean, I think tenure used to work well because, professors were intellectuals and they looked at things objectively, but now tenure protects even the crazies of
yeah,
our
yeah.
professors.
Yeah, and I personally, maybe I'm a little bit of a extremist on this, but I don't like tenure at all. I taught at a university where we didn't have it, and whenever it came up, I made it plain that if the university ever adopted it, I would leave, because I have enough self-esteem. I don't want to work for somebody who doesn't want me around. I'm happy to leave. I'll go someplace else.
Yeah, but I mean, it also, tenure was a protection for a professor who spoke out about unpopular thinking or causes, and they were right on target many times, but it wasn't politically popular. So that was a protection. You'd get rid of that without any qualms?
Yeah, I think I would. Keep in mind that that protection worked when the general climate of opinion was, what it was in our day, and when this political correctness stuff wasn't yet around. But you put that kind of thing in place, and then you have this research, this growth in political correctness. Then you got the apparatus in place to do enormous harm, and you can't fire those people. So I think it's important to look at the long run, and you put an institution in place that may have good intentions, but could sow the seeds for problems later. Well, then don't do it in the first place. That's my view anyway.
Political correctness, beyond its obvious absurdity, doesn't it also create an element of the disintegration of society, of the unity of
Yeah,
society?
yeah. Oh, this political correctness is perhaps the greatest divider of Americans today. And it's happening elsewhere too, not just in the U.S. It makes people full of rage for often next to nothing. They're offended by people who don't mean any offense, and then they become more offensive themselves than the initial offense ever could have been. It spirals downward from there. I think it's sort of infantile behavior. It's like, this is what babies do. They scream and they holler, they dirty their pants because they know somebody else is going to take care of it, and they want something and they want it now. But we have to become adults at some point, and that means, among other things, you start to respect the property and the opinions and the associations and so forth of other people.
Well, this also ties in with the increasing trend towards accepting and even praising multiculturalism. Now,
Yeah.
how much of that was going on in Rome destructively, and how would you compare it to what's going on today in America and especially Europe?
I've always been a person who celebrated the voluntary infusion of different cultures. I love going to Miami and experiencing some of the Cuban culture there, and Hispanic culture in other parts of the country, or the Finnish culture, or Scandinavian culture in northern Michigan, that kind of thing. Because at least in our day, Larry, we know that those people who came from other cultures came and they chose to assimilate, and they're not trying to bring the country down. But in ancient Rome, I think in the latter days, there were a lot of people who just didn't give a hoot about Roman traditions, culture, and customs, and were there to undermine those things. And they were part of the problem ultimately.
Professor, last question. Are we ancient Rome? Are we the Roman Empire in disintegration and beyond all repair?
Well, because I am an eternal optimist, I certainly wouldn't say we're beyond all repair. I hope and pray and work every day that we can bring people to their senses, and some of these destructive trends can be turned around. As to the larger question, are we Rome? Well, no, in one sense. I mean, we are our own people. We're distinct, and no two people who've ever lived have been precisely the same. So we're a totally different crop of people. But the similarities are eerie. We emerged as a country, just as Rome did, in revolt against tyranny. And we were so fed up with concentrated one man rule that we created a republic. We dispersed power. We inaugurated checks and balance, separation of powers, checks and balances, separation of powers, and other republican institutions. Very similar in that regard. And we have been in decline for a lot of the same reasons that Rome declined. So I think that we should take from that the lesson that if you make the same mistakes, you're probably going to suffer the same outcome, even if you're very different people.
So, but you're still hopeful. More credit to you. Whether that's realistic, I don't know. But I think I tend to be more cynical. To me, the trends are all there. Yeah, they're getting more and more pronounced, and going to be because of the political situation. It's going to be very difficult to turn around, I think.
Yeah, no question about that. It will not be easy. But let me encourage you, Larry, to be hopeful, because if you're not, if you're pessimistic, if you think all is lost, well, the one thing we know for sure about the future is that it will be bad if good people who know what the right thing is give up on it. So we can't give up. Don't let the other side ever win a battle without a fight.
A hopeful note and an inspirational note from Professor Lawrence Reed. Professor, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Larry.